Good morning, students. Today, from your book Footprints Without Feet, we are doing chapter number 5 Footprints Without Feet, written by Herbert George Wells. Herbert George Wells was born on 21st September 1866 in England. He was a great writer who wrote novels, history, and science fiction. The most famous works of H. G. Wells are The Time Machine and The Invisible Man. The story Footprints Without Feet is about a scientist, Griffin, who discovers how to make himself invisible. As he was afraid of being discovered in London, where he had committed some crimes, he runs away to a remote village, Epping. However, he runs out of money and resorts to robbery using his advantage of invisibility. The lesson gives a message that misuse of science and its great discoveries can make even a brilliant scientist like Griffin a monster and a threatening, lawless person. The two boys started in surprise at the fresh muddy imprints of a pair of bare feet. What was a barefooted man doing on the steps of a house in the middle of London? And where was the man? So the two mischievous boys are there and they are surprised. They are surprised what? Because the imprints of a bare feet is made on the mud, and these were fresh imprints. What was a barefooted man doing on the steps of the house in the middle of London? So they were surprised that these imprints were formed on the steps of the house, and it is the story of London. And where was the man? But the shocking thing was what? That when these imprints were being formed, there was no man. The imprints are fresh, they are made as if a person is moving from steps to the streets, but then there was no man who was making these imprints. Was it some kind of magic? Was there any ghost? What was that? So these boys are amazed, they are surprised. As they gazed, a remarkable sight met their eyes. A fresh footmark appeared from nowhere, and as they are looking intently at these footmarks being made, they noticed that this fresh footmark was formed, but then there was no person to be seen. From where did that happen? How these impressions were being formed in the mud? Further, how these impressions were formed of the mud on the steps and on the streets. Further, footprints followed, one after another, descending the steps and progressing down the streets. So these two boys noticed that these footprints are being followed, one and then another and then another. So these marks, these impressions can be seen on the steps and onto the streets. And they noticed that these impressions are moving from the steps of the house and are progressing and moving forward onto the street. The boys followed, and the boys, out of curiosity, started following these footmarks. They started following that who is this? What sort of magic is this? They were fascinated, they were attracted until the muddy impressions became fainter and fainter. And they're following and following and following, and the fresh footmarks, impressions are being made from steps to the streets and one and another. And these curious little boys started following. But then the footprints, the impressions became barely perceptible, and at last they disappeared altogether. And then the impressions disappeared. There were no more impressions being formed on the street. The explanation of the mystery was really simple enough. For the readers, this explanation is very easy to understand. But for those little boys, it remained a mystery forever. The bewildered boys had been following a scientist who had just discovered how to make the human body transparent. So these boys, the little curious boys, they were all puzzled and amazed. They were following whom? They were following a scientist. And who was this scientist? This scientist was one who has discovered how to make a human body transparent, that is invisible. So this person who was making the fresh imprints of the mud on the streets and on the streets of the London was a scientist, and he had done this discovery of making a human body transparent. Griffin, the scientist, had carried out experiment after experiment to prove that the human body could become invisible. And now we learn the name of the scientist. The name of the scientist is Griffin. And he had done what? He had done this experiment. So he had done this experiments time and again, and these experiments he did on many things, though it is not mentioned in this chapter, but he started his experiments from mat to a cat and many rocks and many things and cotton, and then he applied this experiment on himself, on a human body, to see that can a human body become invisible. And then yes, it did become invisible. Finally, he swallowed certain rare drugs and his body became as transparent as a sheet of glass, though it also remained as solid as glass. So he did this experiments on himself by taking rare drugs. He took rare drugs and his body became transparent. Slowly and steadily it became transparent like a sheet of glass. But then the body was transparent. But if the person, that is the human body that became transparent, that is Griffin himself, if he is surrounded by people, if he is enveloped by a crowd, then the body could be felt, because the body was there. It was as solid as a glass, though it could not be seen. Brilliant scientist though he was, so this scientist, that is Griffin, he was a brilliant scientist because he has done a beautiful discovery of making a human body invisible. Griffin was rather a lawless person, but then he was lawless. Why lawless? Because he used to threaten people, beat innocent people. He used to do illegal entries in stores and shops and stole things from there. He used to commit killings and bulgari in the houses of the people. So he was a lawless person. His landlords disliked him and tried to eject him. And the landlord of Griffin, the landlord disliked Griffin and asked him to leave the house. He compelled him that you should leave my house. In revenge, Griffin set fire to the house. So Griffin, who was already doing this experiment on himself, he took a revenge on the landlord. He set fire to the house of the landlord. To get away without being seen, he had to remove his clothes. But before he did that, before he set fire to the landlord's house, he did what? He became invisible. So nobody would able to know who set fire to his house, and moreover, to become invisible, he had to remove his clothes. Thus it was that he became a homeless wanderer without clothes, without money, and quite invisible. So he left that house, and now he was a homeless wanderer. Because he was invisible, he was without clothes on his body, he did not have money enough, and he was quite invisible. Why quite invisible? Until he happened to step in some mud and left footprints as he walked. Why quite invisible? Because though he had become invisible, though he cannot be seen by people, but then he could be felt because his body is a solid form, and if the dust, mud, snow, fog, rain settles on his body could be felt. So he happened to step in some mud. So when he left the landlord's house, he was in the streets of London, and he was all happy to make this discovery of being invisible, and he was moving in the streets of London, and by mistake he stepped in mud, and that mud was left on his body, and his footprints could be seen by these little kids, who were amazed to see the fresh footmarks being made on the steps, and left footprints as he walked. And this is how these little kids were curious about the footmarks being made and followed those footmarks. He escaped easily enough from the boys who followed his footprints in London. So, this scientist Griffin, who became an invisible man, was able to escape from the little too curious boys who were following his footsteps. But his adventures were by no means over. But then his adventure of being invisible had just started. He had chosen a bad time of the year to wander about London without clothes. So when he left the landlord's house, he removed his clothes. Now he was in the street of London, but then it was a bad time of the year. Why? It was midwinter, it was the time of winters. The air was bitterly cold and he could not do without clothes. So, because of the winter and a bitter cold, it would be difficult for him to be without clothes. Instead of walking about the streets, he decided to slip into a big London store for warmth. So he could not move in the streets invisible. Though he became invisible, but then he was solid. He was a human body form. He could feel all the seasons, the weather. So he felt cold, and to avoid cold, he did what? He slipped into one of the big stores, the London stores, to get warmth. Closing time arrived, and as soon as the doors were shut, Griffin was able to give himself the pleasure of clothing and feeding himself without regard to expense. So, when the store was closing, it was an evening time when the store closed. He was all alone by himself in this huge London store, and he did what he enjoyed clothing himself, and he enjoyed having some food to eat, and though he did not have to pay for the same. He broke open boxes and wrappers and fitted himself out with warm clothes. So, the first thing he did was to get warmth for himself. So, he opened the boxes and wrappers so that he can arrange for himself some warm clothes to be back again in the London streets with winter or bitter cold. Soon, with shoes and overcoat and a wide brimmed hat, he became a fully dressed and visible person. So, he just went from one store to another in this big huge store, and he chose for himself shoes and hat, and he became a fully dressed visible person, though his form is invisible. But when he wore that coat and shoes and hat, he was a human body, a human figure. In the kitchen of the restaurant, he found cold meat and coffee, and he followed up the meal with sweets and wine taken from the grocery store. So he enjoyed having some food also. He went in the kitchen, he enjoyed having cold meat and coffee from the grocery section. He got for himself some sweets and wine. He enjoyed having this time in the London stores without having to pay for one. Finally, he settled down to sleep on a pile of quills, and finally, it was too late for him, so he chose a pile of quills and he slept over there. If only Griffin had managed to wake up in the good time, all might have been well. Now, Griffin overslept and he did not wake up on time. As it was, he did not wake up until the assistants were already arriving next morning. So it was the other day, the new morning, and the assistants and the workers entered the shop, and Griffin was still sleeping, with the people coming in, with the workers coming in, with the noise. He woke up. When he saw a couple of them approaching, he panicked and began to run. So when he saw the workers over there, the people over there, assistant over there, he was all panicky, he got nervous, and he started running. They naturally gave chase. So these employees, when they saw a headless person running, they started giving him a chase. In the end, he was able to escape only by quickly taking off his newly found clothes. So Griffin, who was running from one store to other store, from refreshment to grocery to various places, suddenly was stuck with the idea that the best way to escape is to remove all clothes, and he started taking off his clothes. So once more he found himself invisible but naked in the chill January air, and again he was invisible, and that is the only way he could escape from being caught by the people. And he was naked again, but then he has to face those weather, the chill January season. This time he decided to try the stock of a theatrical company in the hope of finding not only clothes but also something that would hide the empty space above his shoulders. So when he was again on the streets of London, he had to look for some ways to save himself from this winter, from this chill season. So he thought that the best would be to first get clothes for himself, and the best way to get clothes was to look for a shop, to look for a place where he can get all the necessary things to be visible again in this crowd of people. And the best was to go to a theatrical company where all sorts of theatrical things like nose, mask, whiskers, hat, everything could be stockings, everything could be arranged easily. So he thought it's better I go to some place like this. Shivering with cold, he hurried to Drury Lane, the center of theatre world. So he was shivering with cold, and he went to Drury Lane. And this Drury Lane was a place that was known to the theatre world where all sorts of things could be bought. He soon found a suitable shop. He made his way invisible upstairs and came out a little later wearing bandages round his forehead, dark glasses, false nose, big bushy side whiskers, and a large hat. So he got a shop for himself in this Drury Lane, a shop where all sorts of things were available for him to look like a visible man again. And he explored that shop and got for himself bandages to cover his forehead, dark glasses, false nose, big bushy side whiskers, hat. So this appearance he would look like a human figure with the other costumes and stuff. So he got all this and arranged this from that shop. To escape without being seen, he callously attacked the shopkeeper from behind, after which he robbed him of all the money he could find. And he did not want to come into notice of any person, so he escaped from there. And before he escaped, he did what? He callously attacked, he very insensitively, cruelly attacked the shopkeeper from back, and then robbed his shop of not only clothes and stuffs but also the money that was available in that shop. Eager to get away from crowded London, he took a train to the village of Epping, where he booked 2 rooms at the local inn. Now he knew that crowded London would not be a safe place for him because he might be easily caught, and moreover it was winter, so things would be pretty difficult for him. So he went to what? He took a train to village Epping, and in Epping he went to a local inn and booked 2 rooms for himself. The arrival of the stranger at an inn in winter was in any case an unusual event. So winter season the business was not that good, but then the person coming over there, a tourist coming, a stranger coming over there was an unusual event. A stranger of such uncommon appearance set all tongues wagging. Now this stranger was altogether very strange, very unusual. So people started talking about him. They started thinking about his appearance and the look that he was carrying. So people were very curious to know him. Mrs. Hall, the landlord's wife, made every effort to be friendly. Now, the innkeeper, the owner of the inn, was what? Mrs. Hall. And she made every effort to be very social to this person, that is Griffin. But Griffin had no desire to talk and told her, "My reason for coming to Epping is a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. Besides, an accident has affected my face." So, Mrs. Hall wanted to be social with him, friendly with him. Why? Because a guest was there in when the business was going poor in the winter season, so she wanted to be friendly. But then Griffin snubbed her and was very straightforward in saying that I do not wish to talk much, and the reason for Epping is that I desire to be alone. I want to have a time of solitude, and I do not want to be disturbed in my work. And he did tell Mrs. Hall that he is a scientist and he's into some discovery. Besides, an accident has affected my face, and the reason that he is having such an appearance is because that his face was he had met with an accident, and that is why his face is covered, and that is the reason he is having an unusual appearance. Satisfied that her guest was an eccentric sadist, and in view of the fact that he had paid her in advance, Mrs. Hall was prepared to excuse his strange habits and irritable temper. Now, Mrs. Hall was one person who believed in having money or gaining money. So, she was very much satisfied if the person was paying bills regularly, and moreover, he had paid Mrs. Hall in advance some extra sovereigns also. So, she was ready to take all this eccentric behavior of this scientist, the mad or a crazy person, and she was ready to ignore the strange habits and irritable behavior of Griffin. But the stolen money did not last long. But the money that Griffin had stolen from the shopkeeper in Drury Lane, that money was finished. And presently, Griffin had to admit that he had no more ready cash, and Griffin had no more cash left with him. He pretended, however, that he was expecting a check to arrive at any moment. So, when Mrs. Hall wanted to settle down bills with Griffin, he said that he is expecting some money to come to him through the means of checks, and it might come any moment.